Part 5, Section 1, Chapter 11 of Short History of the Christian Church by John Fletcher Hurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. Intolerance in the Colonies. The intolerance of the Old World was transferred, with modifications, to the New. The two colonies of Virginia and Plymouth represented the two great rival ecclesiastical bodies of England, the Established Church and the Nonconformists. The Virginia colonists were of the Established Church. They had with them a clergyman, Hunt, of that body, and were under his pastoral care. The parish system was adopted after the established model at home. The hostility in England to the Nonconformists, of whom the Puritans were the largest portion, was reproduced in Virginia, and exercised without any show of serious opposition. The New England colonists had suffered keenly from the intolerance of Laud and the Crown at home. The Act of Uniformity of 1662 had thrown out of their livings 2,000 English Nonconformist preachers, for the sole reason that they would not submit to reordination and full endorsement of the Book of Common Prayer. The Puritan exile to America was the child of bitter persecution. The colonists had grown into solidarity and strength under the lash. It is not surprising that when these Puritan colonists now enjoyed liberty, they should not forget the oppressor's hand, nor have a very kindly feeling towards those who had persecuted them. Their intolerance was their means for guarding against a new mastery in the New World. The New England intolerance was directed against all who differed in religious matters from the colonists. The Massachusetts and New Haven colonies were particularly severe against the Quakers. In 1658, the General Court of New Haven passed a severe law against the Quakers as a body "who take upon them that they are immediately sent from God, are infallibly assisted by the Spirit, who speak and write blasphemous opinions, despise government and the order of God in Church and Commonwealth." The penalty of bringing in any known Quakers, or other blasphemous heretics, was a fine of £50. If a Quaker should come for a business purpose, he should appear before a magistrate and receive license to transact his business, and in case of first disobedience should be whipped, imprisoned, put to labor, and deprived of converse with any one. For a second offense, should be branded on one hand with the letter H, imprisoned and put to labor. For a third offense, his other hand should be branded, and he be put to labor and imprisoned. And for a fourth offense, he should be imprisoned, kept to labor until sent away at his own charge, and his tongue bored through with a red-hot iron. This law continued in existence but 2 years. Stiles says that, notwithstanding this law, no witch or Quaker was ever punished in the New Haven colony. The Massachusetts laws were very severe against the Quakers. The records show that 30 were imprisoned, fined, or whipped. 22 were banished, 3 had an ear cut off, and 4 were hanged. The same colony was intolerant of the Baptists. The first members of that communion were fined and imprisoned. The Maine laws were not less tolerant. The first Episcopalians in Connecticut were cast into prison. It should be remembered that the penal laws of New England, against which so much has been said, were only of a piece with the legislation of that time. The laws in England were fully as draconian, even to compelling church attendance and punishing with death larceny to the value of 12 pence. Maryland punished blasphemy at the third offense with death. Virginia outstripped New England in the severity of her punishment against religious offenders. And if no one was put to death by the Episcopalian colony, it was not, as Jefferson remarks, due to the laws, which were harsh enough, but to circumstances. The expulsion of Roger Williams from Salem was a notable case of colonial intolerance. He gave great provocation, however, and the wonder is that he did not fare worse than suffer banishment. He was a Puritan preacher, and arrived with the Salem colony in 1631. He demanded that the Church in Boston should repent publicly of the sin of remaining in communion with the Church of England before coming to America. This the Church in Boston refused to do, and Williams refused to join the Church. The magistrates refused to settle him as pastor. He therefore moved to Plymouth, where he became an assistant pastor. He returned to Salem and succeeded Skelton as pastor, but his permanent settlement was opposed by the magistrates on the ground that he had taught that "it is not unlawful for an unregenerate man to pray, that the magistrate has nothing to do in matters of the first table, that there should be a general and unlimited toleration of all religions, that to punish a man for following the dictates of his conscience was persecution, that the patent granted by Charles was invalid, and an instrument of injustice which they ought to renounce, being injurious to the natives, the King of England having no power to dispose of their lands to his own subjects." As a result, in the winter of 1635-36, Williams was banished. He fled to Rhode Island, where, in 1636, he founded the present city of Providence, which he so called, "from a sense of God's merciful providence to him in his distress." The case of Roger Williams has produced a large literature and a wide difference of opinion. His manner was unfortunate. A man of gentler method might have escaped punishment. The real grounds of his banishment were twofold: his attack on the validity of the company's charter, and his denial of the right of administering oaths to the unregenerate. The first point was one on which the colonists of Rhode Island were peculiarly sensitive, as they had suffered too much to have their rights in the New World put in jeopardy. Williams's views on religious liberty had nothing whatever to do with his expulsion. He was a man of the utmost conscientiousness and sincerity, far in advance of his age, but he was contentious, obstinate, and visionary. The colony of Rhode Island, which was thus founded by Williams and other refugees, granted full religious liberty. Professor Masson speaks of this part of Williams's work as the "organization of a community on the unheard of principle of absolute religious liberty, combined with perfect civil democracy." In the agreement of 1640 are these words: "We agree, as formerly hath been the liberties of this town, so still, to hold forth liberty of conscience." To this day, says Professor Guild of Brown University, the annals of both city and state have remained unsullied by the blot of persecution. The fair promise of this colony, however, was not kept. A law of 1663 excluded Catholics from civil rights, and if none of this faith suffered for their religious beliefs, it was because they kept themselves from so inhospitable a territory. This law was in force until the days of the Revolution. The Virginia colony compelled all persons to attend the parish worship. Roman Catholics, Quakers, and all dissenters were prohibited from settling in the colony, and people of every country who had not been Christians at home were condemned to slavery. There seems to have been more leniency at first than later. In 1642, owing to the few clergymen, a petition went from Virginia to the Plymouth colony to send down some Puritan preachers. Knowles and James were sent in answer to the request, but they were not permitted to remain long. Fears of a large influx, and especially of new opinions, seem to have been entertained, for these men were sent back and their followers were scattered. In 1661 there was a rigid enforcement of the laws against Quakers and all others who were not of the established church. When the dissenting bodies increased, the same prohibition was observed. Moravians, Baptists, Presbyterians, New Lights, and others were persecuted. In 1747 the Reverend Mr. Davis was sent to labor in Virginia. He was a wise, learned, and skillful man. He was very successful. His character and conduct were such as to commend him to all the people. He placed the Presbyterian Church in Virginia on a secure footing. The original Roman Catholic colony of Maryland underwent important changes from the beginning. The liberty of all to settle there was made use of to such an extent that by 1704 the non-Catholics were in the majority. An act was passed by the General Assembly to prevent an increase of Roman Catholics. This remained in force until 1776, when full religious liberty was restored. The Reformed Church was the established faith in the early history of New York. Quakers were fined and imprisoned. In 1656, the governor, Stuyvesant, forbade any other meetings than the Reformed. Baptists were persecuted. When the English came into possession of New Amsterdam, New York, they were tolerant of the Reformed Church, and in one case the same building was used for the Reformed and the Episcopal services. But this toleration was limited at first to the Reformed. Members of other communions received little favor. The first Presbyterian preachers, for example, Makemie and Hampton, were fined and imprisoned for preaching in a private house. The grounds of opposition to the Roman Catholics are not hard to find. They are the only body which was everywhere opposed, except for a time in Maryland, and all the while in Pennsylvania. The extensive missions in Canada, with the line of missions in the West extending down to the Gulf, indicated a progress among the Indians which no Protestant body had met with. The relations of the Roman Catholics with the Indians were cordial. The Indians were very shrewdly taught by them to believe that the English were their enemies. The Puritans had just ground for hostility to the Roman Catholics in England. And, when to this were added the Indian wars, and the association in the minds of the colonists of the Roman Catholics with the uprisings on account of their missionary zeal, it can occasion no surprise that everywhere the Roman Catholic was regarded as not only an ecclesiastical opponent, but a civil enemy. To this must be added the profound antagonism which was naturally engendered in an age of positive religious sensitiveness. Down to the Revolution, there was almost a universal opposition to Roman Catholics on the part of the colonists. In New England, very decided, but in the southern colonies less. Only after the Revolution were all confessions in full liberty of civil and religious rights. The great Roman Catholic immigration then set in, and soon the people of the Roman communion began, by labor and by numbers, to make ample amends for the energy with which their coming to Protestant colonies had been contested. End of chapter 11.